There is no possibility of truly deeply listening if you are not present. We might be trying to fix a problem, trying to solve a problem, trying to fix a person, and that's not listening. That's not truly deeply listening.
Welcome to Toddle School Leaders Project. On today's episode of the podcast, I was so excited to speak with Elena Aguilar. She's the creator of Transformational Coaching. How this model might differ from ones you've seen in the past is that transformational coaching doesn't just focus on behaviors and outcomes. It really focuses on the whole person, their beliefs, and their ways of being. In this episode, we talk about strategies of coaching, whether you're a leader or instructional coach. You're not going to miss a single second, so let's jump right in. Elena, I am so excited to have you here on the School Leaders Project, so thank you so much for joining us.
You are very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So I'd love for you to kick things off for us by just kind of setting the stage. Who are you and what is the work that you do that you're most passionate about?
I am a writer, an educator, a podcaster, a teacher. I started teaching 30 years ago, and I worked in the Oakland, California public schools for 19 years, where I was a teacher, a coach, and an administrator. And during the end of my time there, I wrote my first book, The Art of Coaching, which met what I had seen was a huge need in the area of coaching and really professional development, teacher growth, which was the need for a more holistic and humane approach to coaching than what was out there or what I had been barely trained in when I became a coach. At that point, which was 2012 when I wrote the book, there just wasn't a lot out there on coaching. And what was there was fairly traditional in terms of just working with teachers around instructional practice. And that's important. And when I sat down to coach new teachers, and I had all kinds of ideas about curriculum and instruction, I loved teaching and talking about assessment. It felt hard for us to get to that because often what happened was a teacher would sit down and just burst into tears and tell me about their day and their week and how hard it was. And they didn't think teaching was going to be this hard. And they didn't know if they could keep going on and so on. And I didn't have the skills or the tools to respond to that from a coaching stance. I had empathy as a human and I could kind of respond in that way, but I didn't really know what to do as a coach. Sort of how do I honor and acknowledge everything they're bringing and then get to the curriculum and instruction?
Right.
And so the model of coaching that I developed, transformational coaching, that I started writing about in my first book, really met a need for addressing teachers in a more holistic way.
How beautiful. I love what you said there because I was a curriculum coordinator for a number of years. And I always joked that it was 80% of the time was therapy and 20% was work on curriculum. So I think you really address a need that arises that teaching is an emotional job. So I love that. I'm curious, what do you see as being kind of the key differences in your approach?
So the transformational coaching model that I have developed is anchored in what I call the 3 Bs, which is behaviors, beliefs, and ways of being. And we, as transformational coaches, seek to explore and shift people's behaviors, beliefs, and ways of being, as well as our own.
Right.
We are really tuned into our own. And so this is because every action we take emerges from a belief, whether we're conscious of it or not. Anything we do, whether that is going out to get some exercise or eating kale or sending a child to the office or whatever we do has its roots in a belief that we hold. And whatever we do also is expressed through and from our way of being. And a way of being is how we experience and express emotions. It has to do with our core values, with our identity. And so a transformational coach recognizes that in order to create sustained change, in order to truly transform what's going on in a school or a classroom or an organization, we have to look at those deeper levels. It's a little bit like an iceberg. We see the behaviors on the part of the iceberg that's above water, and below there is the beliefs and ways of being. And so we are really curious about beliefs and ways of being. We seek to surface them, to explore them, and if or when necessary, to shift them. And so that is a key concept that distinguishes this model from others. Many traditional instructional coaching models focus exclusively on behaviors,
Right.
on curriculum, on lesson planning, unit design, assessment, data analysis, and so on. And all of that is important. And all of that is something that a transformational coach also looks at and has skill around. But we don't often see sustained change when we're only focusing on behaviors. We don't see teachers developing resilience, or, on a very sort of technical, perhaps, indicator, we don't see a lot of retention in
Mm.
places that focus exclusively on action or behavior or that sort of surface level, because teaching is an emotional profession and being a human is a difficult thing these days. And we need a model that is more inclusive of our total humanity.
That makes so much sense. I wonder if you might share some of the limiting beliefs that come up in your coaching work consistently, especially with teachers. Like, what are the underlying things that really stand in the way between the actions that we'd like to see in the schools?
Hmm. Um, there's a lot of thinking that I would say is encapsulated in a phrase like, they can't, I can't, we can't. So there's a lot of thinking that references limitations, deficits. Um, Below that, it's important to acknowledge the emotions. There's a lot of hopelessness right now in schools. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of sadness and grief. And so when I hear a teacher saying, this curriculum is great, but it's just way too hard for my kids, they can't do this, what I hear is two things that are really important that are entry points for coaching. One is, I don't know how to make this accessible to my students. And so there's a lack of a sense of self-efficacy, or a lack of being able to meet the core human need for competence. But there's also sadness. And so rather than just hearing what is a little bit surface level, this teacher is blaming students, I'm hearing sadness. I'm hearing someone recognizing their own limitations. And so that's the entry point.
And how do you address that? Because I think is it just a matter of naming it, hearing it, being with a person through that moment?
Well, how you address it is in the art of coaching. It is transformational coaching. And so there are, in the model that I've developed, there are dozens of strategies that we can draw on. There's some variables to consider, like how much trust is there with the teacher? What is the nature of the relationship, the quality of the relationship? Um, but I can offer some simple responses when I hear a teacher say, these kids can't do this. This is too
Right.
hard for them. I might say, that must be hard to acknowledge. I'm curious if I'm hearing some sadness in what you're sharing. Is that present? Does that resonate? And so I'm opening up the conversation about ways of being and about emotions. And one thing I write about a lot in Arise and talk about a lot that's really important to communicate is, coaches are not therapists,
Yeah.
and we don't do therapy. And it's really important to know what that boundary is. And we also need to and can learn the skills to talk about emotions. And we can talk about emotions in a way that honors what happens in therapy, and also that creates that holistic, authentic container for a teacher to engage in coaching, because this work is hard.
That makes me wonder, how do you separately define a therapist from a coach? Like what are the boundaries there?
hmm Yeah, so there's a whole section on that in Arise because it is really important to know. So, one of the things that I often say is a therapist helps us understand the origin of our psychological responses or our adaptations or defense mechanisms and so on. A therapist helps us probe. A therapist helps us go back in our life into our childhoods, our
Um,
relationships with caregivers, all of that stuff. Whereas a coach doesn't dig into the past, doesn't dig into the psyche. We can acknowledge emotions. We can say, I'm hearing sadness. I'm hearing frustration. Is this something you want to explore? And we might explore that. We might hold space for a teacher to talk about, yeah, things are just so hard. And no matter how hard I work, I'm not seeing the impact I want. But as a coach, I will never say something like, you know, are there any times in your childhood when you felt powerless? And that's not a good example of something that a therapist would say. They'd be more skillful than that. But in other words, I know that our emotional reactions now do have their origins in our childhoods, but I won't ask about those because that's not my job. I'm not a therapist.
so
So
you're more present focused.
present and future, whereas I say a therapist is past, present, and future.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
It's tricky work though, and I think especially in US schools, there is an element of separating who you are from what you do in your job,
Mhm.
which feels impossible as an educator. And I wonder, do you face kind of pushback as you go into these conversations for the first time?
I don't. I usually overwhelmingly experience tremendous openness and reception because people are so desperate to be seen and heard in their full humanity. Sometimes there is awkwardness or discomfort, but very rarely because I'm not awkward or uncomfortable with it. And my clients will pick up on my emotions and my comfort. And so when I am in a very relaxed, open, curious way saying, I want to acknowledge it, I'm hearing a lot of grief
Yeah.
and I'm curious if that resonates with you. So I'm not labeling them. I'm inviting their participation into identifying what's going on. I'm bringing it up. I overwhelmingly have people who, I can see their bodies relax. I can hear them sigh and they say, yeah, I am really sad. It's so hard. And I say, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I can see that that's really hard. And so I think we think there's going to be more pushback or discomfort, and that's just not what happens because we are human beings. Human beings have emotions,
Yeah.
and one of the hardest things about emotions is having them all alone or in isolation.
Right.
So when we get to have our emotions, when we get to share them with someone else, they are normalized, they're validated, we connect with someone else, we feel a sense of belonging, and
Mm,
it's just it's what we need as humans.
beautiful. And then from that position of vulnerability and from acknowledgement, is the natural transition then towards problem solving, or do you find that is there a step between those?
So that's a good question. And that is one which a coach needs to be really sensitive around
Yeah.
because we don't want to jump too quickly into problem solving. We don't want to get into fix it mode. And what we want to do is really learn the skills to listen for when a client is ready because
Mm,
they're not going to be ready to get into problem solving mode until they are. Like I can't push it. And so that has to do with how much sort of space and time they need to cultivate some awareness of what they're feeling,
mm,
of the stories they're telling or the beliefs that they're holding that are associated with those emotions. And so we might explore some of the beliefs and often what happens is that a client will get to the point where they will say something like, this curriculum is going to be really hard for my kids, but I know, like, if I just do this thing, or I could try that thing, and that might help them, or maybe I'm giving up too early, or maybe, if we weren't having this conversation on a Friday late afternoon, I would have more energy. So I'm listening for when are they ready? And then I might say something like, so, what are some of the ways that you could scaffold this instruction so that it's accessible to your kids? Is that something you're ready to talk about? And so, as a transformational coach, we are really listening to our clients, letting them lead, letting them find their way back into their sense of agency or empowerment, and not pushing them and not communicating, oh, you are a problem that we need to fix.
That makes so much sense. Is this work primarily done one-on-one, or do you find it's helpful to work in teams? Or what is the, logistically, what does this typically look like in a school?
So, these concepts can all be broadened and applied to working with teams. And I have another book called The Art of Coaching Teams. And that is where I take those ideas and teach how you apply those to group dynamics. But what I'm talking about in Arise, and what I'm really talking about here, is how do you guide an individual's growth and development? And so, coaching, there are decades of research on the impact of coaching as a form of professional development, demonstrating that it is the most efficacious form of professional development because it's ongoing, it's job embedded, it's differentiated. And so when we're looking at, okay, so we've hired these people, we have these people on staff or in our organization, and everybody is going to have to continue developing. How do we develop people? Is it through sending them to an annual conference? Is it sending them to a once a month professional development session? These are typical traditional ways that people are developed. And coaching is, there's again, all this research on coaching is the most effective way to develop a professional. And so that coaching typically needs to take place one-on-one, because that's the definition of coaching in many ways.
Uh-huh.
And so, and it is not exclusive to what happens between a coach and their coachee or their client. So these are strategies that a school leader can use with the front office staff, or with the leader of a team for community development, or with a department head, or with anyone that they manage or supervise. So these are strategies that anyone can use to help someone whom they supervise or support or mentor, to help them develop.
Beautiful. Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one AI-powered teaching and learning platform made for K-12 schools. If you're interested in learning about how Toddle can support initiatives like competency-based learning, transitioning to portfolios, and even standards-based grading, check out our suite of tools, all powered by AI, at toddleapp.com. Now, let's jump back into this episode with Elena. Do you find that in schools, is there typically one instructional coach, or as schools are transitioning, they try to kind of have spokes of leadership, multiple people trained in this modality so that you can kind of spread the reach?
There's a huge range.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just a huge range. There's, schools that have a coach. There's schools that train all of their department heads to use coaching strategies. There are organizations which house their coaches sort of centrally, and then those coaches go out and work with people in different schools. So it's a huge range.
A huge range. But do you find there's a model that, like, if I'm a school leader hearing this and saying, yeah, I want to jump into this. I want my teachers to be coached, but there's one of me and I have a staff of, 50 teachers. How do you think through that practically?
So that's a good question about how do you develop a coaching program?
Right.
And there's a lot to say on that. And for folks who are really interested, I've done a couple of podcast episodes on my podcast, which is the Bright Morning Podcast, on that topic. And
Mm,
so that might be a reference point because there's a lot to say about setting up a coaching program. Um, I would say an ideal scenario is that a school has two instructional coaches or two transformational coaches.
mm,
One for a staff of 50 is definitely not enough. And one by themselves also sort of misses some of the potential because that one coach won't have a colleague with whom they can partner.
right.
Having a coach is preferable to a school leader doing coaching because ideally coaching or growth and development is completely separate from evaluation.
Yeah.
And so a school leader needs to do evaluation. A coach should not be involved in evaluation. And so that can be a differentiation there, a sort of role and responsibility.
I'm so happy you clarified that because I felt that tension a lot. Again, in the curriculum coordinator role, I saw myself more as an instructional coach. And I would be asked to go and observe and to give feedback and to evaluate. And I was like, no, 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 we need to keep these really separate. Might you speak just a little bit more to the importance of that, of separating those roles and why that's necessary?
Sure. So learning requires us to be extremely vulnerable.
Yes.
And if we have a coach with whom we understand that there is absolute confidentiality because that's the agreement of the relationship, we can be really vulnerable.
Mm,
If we know that the person who is supporting our growth and development or a coach is involved with evaluation, we are going to filter because we preserve our job security. And so if I have a coach who is I completely trust, I know it's confidential, I'm going to be more comfortable saying something like, I know that I'm not supposed to have these feelings, but I can't stand that student. She drives me crazy. I would never say that to my school leader or to my
right.
principal, right? Like that's just, I know that. But in order for me to have the kind of breakthrough or growth that I really need to have as a teacher, I need someone who I can be really honest with.
Mm,
And so it's in some ways, it's just this is understanding the really neurobiological needs for learning, understanding the need for psychological safety, understanding that the way that our brain works, the way our minds work, is needs has certain conditions that are necessary in order for us to be able to really learn.
it makes so much sense. I think
Mhm.
a worry I have is that a school leader listening to this might hear, okay, well, I'm involved in the appraisal process, so I don't need to learn about coaching. So, what advice would you have for a person in that position? Is there any role of a coach they should still maintain, or should it be really like separation of church and state, hire somebody separate fully to do that work?
No, so I think now you're referencing you're really talking about leadership and what is
Yeah.
a school leader's responsibility to develop the folks on their staff. And anyone who is leading or managing another person has a responsibility also to help them grow. And so it's a little more complicated, there's more nuance, but a school leader can take a coaching stance to support an educator who's developing or growing. And so they also need to be supervisors or evaluators or managers. And they can take a coaching stance. It's the same way that a teacher sort of has certain rules that they have to enforce in the classroom and so on, but they can also have conversations with students in which they help students understand. There's a lot of different ways that we can show up to help people learn and grow.
That makes a lot of sense. So I love in your book that you talk about the dispositions of a coach and the emotional intelligence and the importance of that. Um, so for somebody who's kind of starting this work, are there exercises or practices that you encourage to build the foundations of those skills and dispositions?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to understand what they are and why they are. And so, as you said, I do describe those in the book. Well, one of the dispositions is, um, well, I can share all of them. They are courage, compassion, curiosity, humility, and trusting the process.
Mm.
And so each of those is a way of being, it's perhaps a value, it's a belief. And so the first step is just understanding them and making meaning of them for yourself, and then reflecting. Many of the strategies that we use in coaching are and the question you're asking is, how do you learn? How do you learn how to enact or embody those dispositions? And that's a question about learning. And
Right.
so reflection plays a huge role in our learning development. And so we might start with taking a disposition like courage and exploring, what are the conditions in which I feel courageous? What happens when I am not feeling courageous? What is it that allows me to re-access my courage? Role playing, practicing. So there's so many different learning strategies to help us to be able to live from those dispositions and work from them.
So what I'm hearing there is just kind of getting grounded in what the dispositions are, but then how do they manifest for me? Where do I feel them in my body? And what does it look like when I am and I'm not in those states? And
Mhm.
knowing yourself really deeply to be able to act more in integrity with the dispositions more of the time.
Mhm. Yeah, and finding the buy-in. And so we have to feel like, I know why this is helpful. I'm bought into this. I will do this. I see the impact of it. So in my book, I am saying these are the most impactful dispositions or states of mind or attitudes from which we can work. But then readers and coaches have to find their own truth in there and
Right.
their own connection and relevance.
Is there a disposition you find particularly powerful to start with, or all are equal and just dependent on kind of who you are?
I think, I mean, I would encourage people to start with the one that feels most accessible to them, most relatable. I would say the easiest to start with can also be the hardest, because in some ways I would say, well, everything is about compassion. Everything ultimately is about, can we engage with each other, with ourselves, with compassion. And also that's a really hard one for a lot of us, and so that's one to explore. um but yeah, I often just encourage people. I mean, what I'm talking about right now in some ways is a principle of adult learning. And so this is theory about how adults learn, and we need to have choice, and we need to be able to enter into what is most within our zone of proximal development.
Right.
And so as a coach, I'm always, so if I'm introducing these dispositions to someone, I might say, is there one of these on here that resonates most for you,
Mm.
or that feels like something you're already doing? And that's where we start.
So smart. I love that you said compassion, because when you said the list initially, I was like, oh, curiosity is the first one. Everybody would say curiosity is the first one, but it just shows how personal that is. That one of my values is agency and personal growth, so it makes sense that I would choose curiosity. And clearly, you're coming from more of the empathetic, compassionate side of things. So it really is such a window into who you are as a leader to see which dispositions resonate with you.
Mm. Well, it's also interesting because one of the things about curiosity is that we can't actually be truly curious unless we feel psychologically safe.
Yeah.
And so true curiosity can't be explored or expressed if we have fear that's really strong and present. And one way that we mitigate that kind of fear is through self-compassion. And so sometimes I do think about it as like, I do think a little bit sequentially of like, compassion comes first and then you can access curiosity.
That makes sense. Are you familiar with Scott Barry Kaufman's work, the sailboat metaphor?
Mm-mm.
A lot of what you said has resonated back to that metaphor for me. It's like a lot of people try to strap on a sail and just set going, but unless you've got a strong boat built, you feel safe, secure, a sense of belonging, that you can't really move forward. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess this feels like ongoing work, right? It feels like a lifetime of work in becoming a coach. But how do you know that you're ready to work with others?
As a coach?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's if you get to ask that question, that's so many coaches that I work with are sort of thrown into the role. They're like learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think are we ever ready? There's more ready, there's less ready. There's what you are just going to learn by doing it, and then the kind of self compassion you will extend to yourself as your skills develop and you look back and say, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I had
Yeah.
known that. Listening is the foundational skill set. And so practicing and learning how to listen
Mm.
is a really powerful starting place. And then ideally, if you have an opportunity to do some learning about coaching before you actually have to be in the role, then that's ideal.
That makes sense. I love that you jumped into listening because you have an entire chapter all about listening. I wonder what are some of your ahas around the art, the skill of listening?
There is no possibility of truly deeply listening if you are not present.
Mm.
If your mind isn't present, if your sort of heart isn't present, when we are not present, then we are not deeply listening. We might be trying to fix a problem, trying to solve a problem, trying to fix a person, trying
Mm.
to tell them our opinion, give them our advice, give them suggestions. And that's not listening. That's not truly deeply listening. When we are fully present, then we are able to take in the expansiveness of what someone wants to share, of who they are. We can then respond with questions or statements that allow someone to discover their own solutions to their problems. Um, this is not to say that there aren't times when a transformational coach is direct or says something like, I really want to encourage you to think about how you could have responded to that student's behavior in a way that didn't end up with her in the office.
Mm.
Or sometimes we do even say something like, you can't send a student to the office for rolling her eyes. You just can't do that.
Right.
And so sometimes we are really direct. Sometimes we do give an opinion or a judgment, but very rarely and very intentionally and selectively. And the majority of the time, we are taking a facilitative stance to allow the client to find their solutions to the problems they're facing. And we can't do that if we're not really listening.
There's such a gentleness to the way you describe the role of the coach, and especially when it comes to listening, that I imagine almost like a calm water, that's reflective of the surface. And I wonder how you find that space consistently because we all know schools can be so chaotic and there's so many big emotions. So how do you best put yourself in a space to be a great listener?
hmm Well, schools can be really chaotic. The world is chaotic. Our lives can be chaotic. I often say a transformational coach starts with themselves.
Mm.
We have to explore our behaviors, beliefs, and ways of being. We have to work on ourselves. We have to do our own everything that we can. What I love about the work I do and the coaching I do is that everything I practice as a coach is relevant in every part of my life, in
Mm.
all of my relationships with my husband, with my son, with my friends, with my father. All of the presence that I bring in coaching conversations, I also bring or attempt to bring in those other spaces. And so that I think is one of the reasons why I have been so committed and have found so much energy for cultivating my way of being as a coach
Mm.
is because it's not something I leave at the door when I leave work. And so, how do we cultivate the kind of inner presence that allows us to show up as a still, reflective surface is a great question. And I would say, I think that's an astute observation because there's so much research behind everything I write and share. And a lot of what I use is actually research from neuroscience. And so, for example, it has been known for a good like 20 years now that our brains have something that are called mirror neurons, which are what makes us have the experience of someone's emotion being contagious. And
Right.
so, if I am talking with someone who is really relaxed and calm, I'm going to notice that I start feeling really relaxed and calm. If I'm with someone who's really agitated, I might notice that I could start feeling agitated unless I can use the skills that I have to stay anchored and calm. What's really interesting also is that whenever there is a power differential, like there is between a coach and a teacher, so the coach has more positional power. Whenever there's a power differential, the person in the position of sort of
Deference.
less power will be aligning to the person who has more power. So that means that if I come in and a teacher is really distraught and distressed, but I'm really calm and centered, they will mirror me
Mm,
less than me picking up on their, mirroring them. And so this kind of research, as well as my experience living this, has made my commitment to um, cultivating that inner sense of calm and presence
mm,
even deeper. Because I see how it's not about, do I come up with a great question? It's not about, do I have the answer? It's about how I am being
mm.
and how my client can regulate their nervous system off of my nervous system. So
Yeah.
they're aligning to me. So how do we cultivate, a calm inner presence? I can just share what I do, which again, as I said, like positively impacts me in all aspects of my life. So I have had a meditation practice for decades. I meditate every morning. I love the experience. I find that that deepens my well being in all aspects of my life. I have a number of morning practices that get me grounded for the day. The first couple hours of my day are my most precious time.
Mm.
And I do everything that I can to have that time. I can't have it always, but I go to bed early. It's that morning time for me. It's the things that we know and that we know we should do, like getting exercise, getting some sunlight, listening to music, all the things that I know if I'm feeling a little bit off or I'm not feeling as calm or grounded, then for me, putting on a piece of music for 3 minutes can really shift my state of being.
Yeah.
Doing breathing exercises, eating well, all that kind of stuff that helps me feel good and also just has a positive impact on others because I am present and regulated. And so in my new book, Arise, I talk about this a lot more. And I also do things like plug therapy a lot
Yeah.
because I have found for me, it's not the be all end all. And I have a lot of caveats about acknowledging the limitations of therapy. And it's been instrumental in helping me to get to the root of some of the things that caused me to not feel present for a while.
Oh, there's so much beauty in what you said. And I think it's so important now more than ever because at least when I was in the classroom, there was this intense pressure to almost just like give every part of yourself to this profession, which is just not sustainable long term. And that I think for a leader, any leader to be modeling, I have a full, healthy, happy, regulated life outside. Like I work out and I have hobbies and I have social connection that you're not a bad teacher because you take care of yourself. I think it's such a common misconception in our field.
Yeah, it's really one like, I mean, I do feel like for, a couple of decades, even when I started teaching 30 years ago, like that was sort of being talked about. But I think what's missing is conversations and opportunities to dig into why is it that the teachers, for example, fall into these helper roles where
Right.
it feels like we are, in a helper, savior, martyr role, and nothing is ever enough. And we know we're supposed to be doing all these things to take care of ourselves. But I think there's sometimes a sort of perpetuation of blaming the teacher for
Right.
not being able to navigate what is a deeper issue and also a systemic issue, and is also is an issue that requires structural changes. And so there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot that we can do as individuals, and there's a lot that we can learn how to accept, say no to, say yes to, prioritize, and so on. But the role of a teacher is really, really, really hard. I think part of the work of a coach is helping a teacher understand the reality that they're in, the
Mm.
conditions. A transformational coach does need to use a systems thinking approach to understand the interconnectedness of it all. A coach can help a teacher recognize what is within their influence and control, can help a teacher make decisions, can help a teacher prioritize, navigate all the emotions that come up, the beliefs that are entangled. So, the situation that we're referencing is a dilemma, and dilemmas can't be solved. They're not problems, they are dilemmas. They can be navigated. There will likely always be some tension, some sense of um, tension, struggle,
Yeah.
grappling. But what we can do as coaches is learn how to live with that, learn how to be with that, learn how to expand our tolerance for discomfort, because there's just a lot of discomfort.
Well, I've got one last question for you. So I'm curious, after all the work that you've done in this space, what still surprises you about coaching?
Oh, what still surprises me about coaching, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how much I love it. And so I've been coaching for 21 years, and I just love it. Like I love coaching people. And I love the puzzle of figuring out how to know someone, how to help someone grow. I love the experience of being with someone in their growth process. It's such a beautiful thing to witness. I feel so honored when people allow me to coach them and to witness them in such a vulnerable, expansive state. I am surprised. This is kind of a confession, I suppose, but I'm so surprised by how well transformational coaching works. Sometimes I think, like, I talk about it so much, I write about it, I teach about it, and then often I demonstrate coaching conversations, and I often say like 15 minutes is all we need. And there's a section in Arise with that same title. And sometimes I go into it thinking, can I really prove in 15 minutes like transformational coaching works? And I'm just so often blown away by, like, wow, this really does work. Like, people
Yeah.
really shift and change, and it's really beautiful, and it makes me have so much hope and optimism in what is possible in our schools, in our organizations, and really in our world for human beings. Human beings, we have kind of a mixed record, I think, in terms of our being human beings and being kind to each other and compassionate. And I often just leave coaching conversations feeling so hopeful about what is possible.
I love that. Just being affirmed in our shared humanity. And that if we can come back to that, there's infinite potential.
And that we can grow. We can grow and we can change. And that's what it is. Coaching is all about growing and changing. It's like, yeah, I coach teachers all the time who hold really racist beliefs about their students. And I can see those shift so fast. Or I coach teachers who feel so despairing and hopeless. And I can see that shift so fast. And so I can see growth. I can see change in 15 minutes. And that's what gives me hope.
So beautiful. Well, this is such a fun conversation. There's so much to unpack. I think I'm going to have to listen back to it quite a few times, but so appreciative of just your wealth of knowledge and what you're bringing to our profession and for your time today.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.